Hello, now that the eclipse has passed and everybody's sick of it, I thought that I was going to add my own to the mix. Since I was not in the path of totality, but more like in the path of 95% and also having to work on the 8th, I really didn't plan too much for the eclipse, although I do have one of those magical P1000s and a tripod, so I was able to set it up with a solar filter, zoom in to a reasonable amount, and while I was working, I would let the thing take time-lapse images, having to go back out every so many minutes to reposition the camera. I was rushing to set the camera up, and I think that I had picked most of the center for the camera exposure, and here the sun is starting to go outside of that, and it's trying to expose for the middle rather than the outside. And because there were clouds, and I'm not sure if the solar filter that I had made was leaking light from outside around the edges or not, so this may or may not be from my filter, and it may or may not be from the cloud cover. It may or may not be from the camera improperly exposing that particular frame, but you can see the halo around the sun, and then as it goes more into the middle, it tends to expose it more properly. So the hour or so that was leading up to the point of maximum eclipse in my area was fairly uneventful, and I was just running out to the backyard to reposition the camera and set the time lapse up again. Overall, that part really didn't seem that much out of the ordinary. It remained fairly bright when I was working, and I could see on either side of me outside. There were moments when everything seemed to be a little bit dimmer than just a few seconds before. I wasn't really sure if it was that or whether it was the cloud cover that was coming and going. I did start earlier that day. I was able to work from home, so I was able to change my working hours so that I could go outside for the period of maximum eclipse. So for my location, it started at about 3:15 and it lasted until about 3:30 or maybe 3:35. Here's a point of maximum eclipse. By this point, I was already outside for about 15 minutes, and I was able to notice everything that was going on around me, although technically I was still playing around too much with the camera to pay serious attention to everything around me. But there were four things that I noticed. Luckily, I had watched a video from the channel Smarter Every Day where Destin was talking to this other guy explaining what to look out for. The first thing, which is the obvious, is the rapid diminishing of sunlight. And at this point, at the point of maximum eclipse over here at the 95%, there was still enough light that everything remained visible. It felt like it was about maybe 2 or 3 minutes after the sun had set in terms of brightness. In terms of colors, which is one thing that I would not have expected, but on that Smarter Everyday video was made aware that the perception of colors will change during an eclipse. So I paid attention to the different colors of all of the objects around me. And sure enough, at this point, for a short little while, the colors did tend to appear quite muddy, almost brown in color. The red looked a little bit more brown. The nearby houses looked a little bit more brownish, just really more attenuated in color. But what really struck me in terms of a noticeable change of color was the cedar hedge. And I think looking back on it, it was more a question of a biochemical after effect and or possibly even an optical illusion. I noticed that the cedar hedge did not appear its normal color. It tended to have a bit of a purple hue to it. If you look at a very bright green object and then you close your eyes or you look at a fairly gray background, the green tends to look red rather than green because that part is the biochemical aspect of the eyes trying to recover from being depleted of seeing the green, and so it overcompensates and it thinks that it's more red than green. But when I looked at the hedge, it seemed to be a little bit more purple rather than red. And it wasn't a in-your-face purple color. It still looked green, but it looked a little bit more purple than it should have. What I also noticed was shortly before the point of maximum eclipse, the wind picked up, and within 10-15 seconds, the temperature dropped dramatically and the wind continued for a little while, and then the wind eventually stopped, and then gradually the temperature started to come back up again. I did not pay attention to exactly when that happened, if the wind died down and the temperature started to come back up again before the point of maximum eclipse, or whether it was around that time, but that was definitely something else that I felt. The intensity of the cold I would attribute to the fact that we're in April. The ground itself is still much colder than it feels because the ground still has to absorb heat, having just come out of winter. So when we suddenly take the sun away, the ground absorbs any residual heat that was in the air and it makes it feel much colder. The wind was probably due to the moving shade of the path of totality and a higher pressure moving towards the lower pressure, etc., etc. So this is probably true no matter where you are. There's probably going to be a wind picking up as the eclipse is occurring, and then at some point when the air begins to stabilize, then the wind stops. Exactly when that happens, I wasn't paying attention. The last thing that I noticed was that the birds were starting to chirp quite a bit, as if they thought it was 10-15 minutes before sunset. At some point, they probably realized that it wasn't night, so they just stopped. But again, since it wasn't a complete eclipse, but just a partial over here, there did not seem to be any direct correlation between them starting and or stopping relative to the total light levels. Having experienced this eclipse, if I ever got the chance to experience another one, I would probably not bother at all with the cameras or even the glasses. In the case of a total solar eclipse, I would probably only look at the sun when it is completely eclipsed. The rest of the time I would be looking at all of the surroundings. I would really pay attention to all of the various trees, buildings, objects all around me well before the eclipse starts to get a sense of what normal looks like. And then at the point of totality, I would try to compare that in my mind to what normal was to see how everything changed in colors. I would also try to get a sense of the different sounds around me. As the sun is being eclipsed more, are all of the critters getting a little bit more active? During the maximum of the eclipse, are they stopping? When the moon is receding and the sun is starting to come back, are they getting active again or are they remaining silent? I would try to get a sense of observing the various patterns of the animals and the insects to see whether or not there is one period of activity just before, or if there are two periods of activity, one being before the eclipse and the other being after, so on and so forth. Get a sense of all of the different color shifts, try to describe the changes of colors, etc. While I'm at it, I'm going to play a time lapse of the images that my camera I had set up 5 years ago to look up at the sky saw before, during, and after. It really doesn't appear to be out of the ordinary. In fact, you can't even see anything happening on that. I'm also going to put a picture of this one. The two are not synchronized, but this one is going to be a bit of a slideshow inside the other one. So my advice to anybody who might want to witness a solar eclipse in the future would be you could wear glasses if you want and look at the eclipse. Although leading up to the point of totality, you're probably not going to see very much happening, probably just a very opaque circular object eclipse a very bright circular object. And instead, I would focus on getting a sense of the room, so to speak, by paying attention to all of the various objects and the various colors of each of the objects, and pay attention to the different smells and the different sounds, and try to paint a picture of how that changes during the progression of that eclipse. That's going to be it. Thank you for watching. If you like the video, you know what to do. With that, I'm going to see you again in another video soon enough. So bye for now.